Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break, and it's still bright early and sunny, so hopefully we can go for a walk out later. But for now, I'm excited to introduce to you our next panel, our Urban Planning and Housing panel. And it's my pleasure to introduce Chaitanya Ahuja, who is a junior fellow here at Massey College and a master candidate in civil engineering. So please help me welcoming.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and to be moderating this panel with some really distinguished experts in this field. I'll take a second to introduce them. So starting with Karen Chappell. Karen Chappell, PhD, is Director of the School of Cities and Professor of Planning at the University of Toronto. Chappell studies inequalities in the planning, development, and governance of cities and regions. Her book, Planning Sustainable Cities and Regions Towards More Equitable Development, won the John Friedman Book Award, and she recently published Transit-Oriented Displacement or Community Dividends, Understanding the Effects of Smarter Growth on Communities. Chappell received the 2023 Regional Studies Association's Sir Peter Hall Award for lifetime contribution to the field, and is Professor Emerita of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. I'll introduce Juliana Duque. Juliana Duque leads the affordable housing, retrofits, and construction workforce development work of the ILEO initiative at United Way Greater Toronto. Prior to this role, she led the Workforce 2030 Coalition at the Canada Green Building Council and managed complex cross-sector partnerships to advance nature conservation and urban innovation at WWF Canada and Evergreen. Juliana holds a master's degree in environmental studies with a business and environmental diploma from York University, a master's in marketing communication from Emerson College, and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Bucharest University. Lastly, Dr. Carolyn Witzman. Dr. Carolyn Witzman is a housing and social policy researcher and adjunct professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities. Her research focuses on scaling up affordable and non-market housing. She has advised UBC's Housing Assessment Resource Tools HEART project, which developed best practices for assessing housing needs and increasing non-market housing supply. Carolyn is the author or co-author of 6 books, including Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis, which came out last year. And she has published over 80 works on housing and urban equity and has advised national and local governments, UN Women, UN Habitat, and nonprofits. Her work addresses the intersection of housing policy, equity, and the right to the city. So we're really lucky to have these experts with us here today for this panel. I'll start by asking maybe to take a second to introduce yourself, your work, and maybe share one of your proudest or most impactful accomplishments in the field of equitable housing and urban planning. Maybe we can start with Juliana and then make our way back this way.
So I just talking. Okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Juliana Duque, and I've been working with United Way for about 3 years on issues related to affordable housing, which relative to my esteemed panelist is a drop in the bucket. I am fairly new to the space, having worked more in the environmental and conservation organizations. I'd say that in terms of things I'm really proud of that we've done at United Way relative to affordable housing is within the initiative of Inclusive Local Economic Opportunity, which is an initiative that has been going on for about 5 years at United Way. We started it with BMO and a variety of private sector partners to look at issues related to gentrification and the risks associated with large-scale redevelopment on local population and resident population, specifically in low-income neighborhoods, is really to focus the work of this group, which includes 30 organizations across nonprofit, City of Toronto, and private sector, to actually focus on housing. It is a subject that felt fairly intimidating at the beginning. We focus more on entrepreneurship and good jobs and getting people into employment, things that are, I think, more relatively closely associated to economic opportunity. But the recognition that having a safe, affordable place to live is fundamental to accessing economic opportunities became much more apparent. So we've been working, across all the partners that we have at the ILEO table to actually develop new solutions related to housing. So having City of Toronto representatives, bankers, wealth managers, nonprofit housing developers at the table, and really working together, rolling up the sleeves in a very practical way to develop new models to make things function better, especially in the neighborhoods we care most about, is something that I'm pretty excited about, and that's kind of the focus of my work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carolyn Weitzman. I'm now on my third career. My first career started after I did my master's in the ugliest building of University of Toronto, Sydney Smith, and I worked at the City of Toronto for 10 years doing integrated policy on violence prevention. And I actually have a wonderful story from then, but I'm not going to tell that story. My second job, I went back as a quite mature student, did my PhD, worked as a professor of urban planning at the University of Melbourne for 16 years. So my proud story on housing comes from that time. There was a new government elected at the state level, provincial level in Australia, and they came to me and said, we want to create more affordable housing, but we don't want to spend any money. And I said, let me introduce you to land policy. So we did some work with them, with some non-market and market developers, with municipalities on, first of all, what is the definition of affordable housing going to be for the purpose of policy? They didn't really have one. In fact, the Planning Act didn't even say that affordable housing is one of the goals of planning. Well, that's free to kind of make a change to the Planning Act. Well, I mean, you have to publish it and everything, but do some training. But that's kind of important. So we did some wording for the Planning Act. We did some wording on defining affordable housing using income categories. And then we mapped all of the government land in the state, and particularly in the capital city of Melbourne, that was suitable, well located in terms of affordable housing, and talked about mechanisms to use that land to scale up public housing, co-op housing, which exists in Australia, non-profit housing, to help meet some of the needs we'd identified. And that actually had a lot of influence. So then when I came to Canada, or came back to Canada about 6 years ago, we did that project with the Housing Assessment Resource Tools. It's had an impact in terms of, at least at the municipal need assessment level, we're now talking about what are, the main question of housing policy is always who needs what housing, where, and at what cost. So now, at least in municipalities, they can identify what kind of rents are affordable to people on social assistance, or people who have in minimum wage jobs, or starting professionals. What can they afford to pay? We've done some mapping in municipalities about where the considerable discount from providing free leased land can help. I can't say, I don't think we've brought about a revolution in federal government policy yet, but we're just starting, unfortunately, the dialogue about how we can have consistent language and consistent policies around affordable housing. And I'm proud of the role that I've played in that.
Great. So it's great to be back here at the beautiful Massey College. Always a pleasure. My work has really centered on equity for 25 years now, 20 years in California. And so forgive me if I give some California examples throughout our hour together, because I still think, having come here 4 years ago, I still think Canada has a lot to learn from California about how to bake equity or how to center equity in its policies and planning. In fact, one of the biggest shocks I had in coming to Canada was that the word equity was missing from most planning, actually. Regional Transportation Plan doesn't mention equity. We've been working on this for decades around the world. I don't know what happened in Canada. But maybe maybe this conference is the start of the turning point, right? So it's a wonderful program. So my work on equity came to fruition in a book on equitable development, which kind of points out the contradictions in how we are planning our cities that, or not planning them, that we have kind of drive till you qualify sprawl, people out in the suburbs who then can't get to jobs. And so I discuss in that book how we can make the core more diverse, how we can make space for all the low income and moderate income and middle income folks that need to live in the core of our regions rather than pushing them out to the outskirts. And I didn't know it at the time. I wrote the book 10 years ago. I didn't know at the time, but that's Toronto's story. So perfectly applicable here. But then there's lots of pieces of planning to think about if we want to make the core more equitable. Like, how about employment lands? We don't think enough about jobs in the core, but we want to make our jobs accessible. We want to save some land for job clusters so that, again, people don't have to get in their car and drive for hours to get to employment. Many other aspects. But one of the things I landed on in the process of working on that book was thinking about displacement, because what's happening is people are displaced from the core. It's been happening for decades. Our cores are becoming less and less diverse. Toronto is a bit of an exception here because of the wonderful work of TCHC and the amount of social housing we have in the core that's been kept there. San Francisco is an exception. New York City is an exception. That's about it in North America. Vancouver, sorry. So with the displacement work, and that's my one achievement I want to point to, I started working for the state of California on understanding displacement around transit, because the state of California was getting sued. Because as it was building new investments, transit stations, bike lanes, parks, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which it has mandated itself to do, and it has done very successfully, in contrast to Ontario, that mandate has actually led perversely to the displacement of low-income people of color from those cities. So I started something called the Urban Displacement Project. It's at urbandisplacement.org. I bought the URL on a whim for $1 and 10 years ago, and I get 100,000 unique visitors there a year. Many more than my current gig, School of Cities, but I'm hoping to build School of Cities up as much as Urban Displacement. Urban Displacement is a portal for information on commercial, residential, industrial displacement, and has a global lens. And it managed, one of the things I wanted to do with that project was, number one, shift the dialogue into thinking about displacement and out of thinking about gentrification. Because what happened, and I knew this from years working with communities, the gentrification conversation was not productive, because you want revitalization, you want money to come into communities. So it's very confusing for people or for businesses to understand why they should stop gentrification. But if you say to people, we don't want people to be displaced from their homes and businesses, that people can all get behind. And so gradually in California, this is the achievement, we saw this shift in dialogue from gentrification to displacement. And because of the work we did for the California Air Resources Board on identifying how much displacement occurs around transit, we had every state agency in California adopt an anti-displacement policy. So it's the parks, Department of Parks and Rec has one, Transportation has one, Air Resources has one, the Strategic Growth Council has one, the Environmental Department has one, so Public Works has one. And so this is just baked in now to policy. So let's do this in Ontario and Canada.
Thank you so much. For the next question, please feel free to jump in on each other's ideas. As we all know, urban planning today presents many, many different challenges: affordability, quality of housing, transportation access, strained infrastructure, climate change, pollution, access to services. How are urban planners and experts able to balance all of these competing interests? And please feel free to draw from your own work or experiences. Sorry, it's a big question.
I love the fact that it was like, big question. Let's look at Carolyn. So one thing to keep in mind is that there was a fellow in New York City named Robert Moses, and he was the Parks Commissioner, also in charge of housing, also in charge of freeways. He was a unicorn. Generally, people don't stay in jobs for 50 years and have as much power as Robert Moses is. So Jane Jacobs, famous theorist, she started as an activist in New York City with this big, bad planner. Bottom line is, planners advise. Generally, planners don't have direct political power. Politicians have direct political power. So part of the challenge of planning is to make convincing problem-solving arguments that make it easier for politicians and for the citizenry to make the easy choice the right choice. And that has to do with communication skills. It has to do with diversity amongst the group of planners who are making that advice. But planners, even at our most senior, and I'm pretty darn senior right now, I spend a lot of my time talking to groups, talking to politicians, talking to the media about what a better, more equitable, more diverse city, community, region would look like. So I'm sort of twisting your question a tiny bit, because it's not like planners have been talking about the need for well-located housing within proximity of transit and jobs and services since the 1990s, if not beforehand, and I would argue to surprisingly little effect. So for me, the question of planning is partly about triple bottom line sustainability, about human rights, about justice, but it's also very much how are we communicating those preferred decisions in a win-win way, in a convincing way, in a easy to understand way. So I think I'll leave that question there.
Yeah, I mean, in our interactions with planners at the Inclusive Local Economic Opportunity table, arguments tend to sometimes get very technical very quickly. And one of the things that we're always doing in partnership with our community partners is to always bring up who you're planning for. Who are the people living in these neighborhoods? Who's going to use the parks? Who's going to use the housing? Who's going to use the transit services? Because if you don't think of who you're planning for and who's going to be ultimately the beneficiary of all this work, you might end up with a kind of poor decision making and just not appropriate choices. So for example, in the neighborhoods that we're focusing right now, which is kind of in the Greater Golden Mile area, I don't know if people know Scarborough, Greater Golden Mile, kind of between Birchmount and Victoria Park, major secondary plan that's been put in place there. The way the secondary plan has been designed, it's really a collection of very separate developments that are not really tied together to work as a neighborhood, and certainly not keeping in mind who lives in the surrounding area of the Golden Mile, because Golden Mile is, it's a collection of commercial space and parking lots, but there's lots of neighborhoods around. So, always bringing up, who you're doing this for, and thinking what's the household income. In the Greater Golden Mile is $65,000. That's the median household income. That means people there can afford an average rent of $1,650. So is the housing that you're approving, that or around there, or if not, what kind of measures are you putting in place to ensure we get to that? 7,000 people there are on social assistance, on Ontario Works benefits. That 1650 seems all of a sudden quite out of reach when you were thinking of that population. So all these types of questions and always bringing up these numbers in front of planners is something that we do so that we don't forget who's this for.
So I want to go in a little different direction, though I don't disagree with anything you guys said. Unfortunately, there might be a lot of agreement on this panel. So what I see as the challenge is just what you said. You said, planning, housing, transportation, how are we going to solve the problem? Well, that's exactly the issue, is that we have all these silos and that we're working in these silos and we don't have the language, but we also don't have the arenas. We don't have the fora to get together and speak across the silos. And our government is, organized this way, but the university is organized this way too. It's the bane of my existence. When I arrived, so I head the School of Cities, which is multidisciplinary. We work with 65 different departments. That's the mandate from our president, Merrick Gertler, who's a geographer and planner, but understands the importance of multidisciplinary perspectives coming together to solve challenges, that you're not going to solve it in one field alone. When I arrived, and I was talking to one of my colleagues in geography, and he said, I don't understand why you need multidisciplinarity. In geography, we are all multidisciplinary already, so we don't need the other departments. We don't need to collaborate with them. And I was just horrified, because, this is what's wrong with geography, is that they think it's multidisciplinary. What arrogance, right? And what they're doing is bad anthropology and bad planning, and they think but don't get me started.
Speaking of an alumni of University of Toronto's Geography School.
I'm a planner. My PhD is in planning, so I feel like I can critique the geographers. But this is the big problem, I think, of our time, is how we break down these silos when we are only reinforcing them in our educational systems and our government departments. There are mechanisms. There are things we could tap into. And again, I'm going to go back to California. One of the reasons anti-displacement policies got baked into every department is the governor, Newsom, formed an anti-displacement interagency working group, and everybody had to show up once a month to say what they were doing to keep people in place as change was happening. That made the difference. So, these are very simple, informal governance mechanisms that can really help us deal with these kind of very intractable issues.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to talking about the affordability crisis within the current global circumstances. So, within Toronto and other large urban centers, affordability and housing supply is a huge problem. We know this. The most underserved communities, including the unhoused and low-income individuals, are feeling the brunt. In Toronto, almost one-third of households are struggling with housing affordability challenges, spending over 30% of their income on housing costs. And low-income households, renters, racialized populations are more likely to struggle with housing need. So that's like the current situation. But with the affordability crisis and uncertainty likely to be made worse by our shifting relationship with the United States, how do you think our communities and policies should pivot to include and magnify voices and needs? And I have a part two to that. Are there any... I feel like I want to put a positive spin as well. So are there any hidden opportunities that you might see or want to touch upon in this situation?
Okay, maybe I can start on that one. There's certainly no shortage of depressing statistics. I think every report I see, every statistic I see, just paints a dire and dire picture around housing. As United Way, as an organization that focuses on poverty reduction, we're certainly gearing up for more work for us in that sense, because none of this is conducive to better stability or poverty reduction. Like we're likely to see, harder conditions for lower income people and more urgency and just more of a response. So we're really working to balance our activity across the systemic change we need to see, but also the response role that United Way has traditionally played in society. So with our housing and homelessness granting and with our programs related to to really stopping the bleeding as it goes. So I think we're really focusing on what can we do in these very rapidly shifting circumstances and the choices we need to make across all these many things we need to be doing. And unfortunately, with this deeper uncertainty and no new houses being built, lots of existing affordable housing is being lost, I think we're going to focus on just stopping the bleeding of affordable housing and seeing what role we can play in terms of acquisition by the nonprofit sector. So we're working right now. We have a pilot going on with a few organizations to support their applications into the MURA program, the city's municipal multi-res acquisition program, just to ensure that the nonprofit sector can be in a position to provide permanently affordable housing by buying buildings mainly and keeping them affordable in perpetuity. So things that we can do to really stop evictions and just kind of limit the flow from precarious living into homelessness. And then working with all the players, all the folks in government to have more and better aligned such acquisition programs that can lead to just a more scale that we can give to the nonprofit sector to really play a stronger role in affordable housing.
Yeah, I don't want to understate what a dire situation we find ourselves in right now. So even just focusing on housing for a moment, homes, like even more than cars, are a very complex product, and a lot of the materials that we get are from the US and don't have easy substitutions. So tariffs are going to harm home building in both Canada and the US, no doubt. Certainly in the short term, possibly in the long term.
And it isn't as though housing supply was so healthy beforehand. It actually was in a slump before, and now it's going to get much, much worse. At the same time, we're looking at up to 1 million new unemployed people, and about half of renters have less than $200 in savings. One of the reasons why CERB came in, the emergency response benefit during COVID, is because widespread unemployment was felt quite correctly to be a precursor of widespread homelessness, because people, households across Canada are generally quite over-levered. We have some of the highest level, well, probably the highest level amongst developed countries of debt in the world. So we have a third of households in Canada are renters. A lot of them are paying, never mind more than 30, 50, 70% of their income on rent. They are literally one paycheck away from homelessness. So we'll be seeing more poverty, more homelessness. Again, no doubt about that. The third factor, of course, and this ties to the first conversation, is we'll be seeing more refugees. We saw more refugees during Trump 1, as refugees come across a very large and until recently, for a long time, very peaceful border. We'll be seeing lots of Americans who aren't refugees, who are first and second generation immigrants fleeing the US. At a certain point, we'll be seeing lots of people making decisions from other countries. They may have once considered the US, they'll be considering Canada, Australia, Europe, etc. So we should expect an influx of immigration, including people who are legally asking for refugee status.
we're going to be seeing further risk, income loss, risk of homelessness, and we're going to see even higher costs of housing when the costs of housing are already super high, like insupportably high. So I'm not suggesting we all go home and, put our head under a pillow for the next 4 years, as sometimes I feel like doing.
This is the 30s again. This is a threat of fascism, of anti-democratic countries, this time very close to our border, plus the threat of, well, we've already been seeing an economic downturn, the chance of a very rapid economic downturn. And, there was this guy named John Maynard Keynes, and he talked about counter-cyclical investment and the need to invest in productive, job-creating, infrastructure-creating work. And that need is huge in Canada. We have a transportation system, a public communal transportation system that's no longer fit for purpose. We have a housing system where we haven't really invested in low-cost housing since the early 1990s. That's 3 decades. We have climate change threatening our most basic infrastructure system: water, sewers, flood mitigation, fire mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. We desperately need a new generation of infrastructure investment, a new generation of innovative ways to have a more climate-friendly, equitable future. We need to rise to that challenge rather than saying we are now too poor to meet that challenge. I mean, at the point where I'm saying all of these dire things, I'm also saying there's $7 trillion in Canadian banks. There's another $7 trillion in various investments in Canada. The federal government, at least until Poilievre gets in, spends about $2 trillion. No, sorry, that's GDP is $2 trillion a year. But in any case, there's a lot of money floating around Canada. So how can we use those resources, institutional, communal, government resources, to make a better future? Because if we don't make a better future now, we can't wait until things get better. They're going to continue to get worse, I'm afraid, for the next while.
So I was hoping you would bring up what you said yesterday at the panel. Which, Carolyn was at the Board of Trade on a housing panel yesterday and said, we need counter-cyclical measures. So
That's what I was trying to say.
Yes,
I was just
yes.
too wordy about it. What she said, what I said.
That's what you were getting to. So absolutely. So this is a huge opportunity. I think I read an op-ed in the Star this morning. I read these things when I'm half asleep, and I never remember where I read it. And but somebody writing about this is not the time to just give the newly unemployed Canadians a check. But instead, we need to actually do something and to make ourselves more innovative, productive, and independent. So this is the time, really, for economic development. And there's various ways that this could go. Yes, every crisis is an opportunity, right? So I mean, we could. So the tariffs are going to fundamentally alter supply chains. One of the things that it might do in the housing realm is create a space to do things quite differently. A space that we don't usually have. It's very hard to disrupt the status quo. So what if we said, maybe this is the time for modular housing. Maybe this is the time to invest in a whole bunch of do counter-cyclical investments in a number of factories. What was it we heard yesterday? The New Brunswick. There's a New Brunswick factory that sells modular to the U.S. oh, let's do it in Canada. And so that's one thing, is to build up this capacity. And then there's purchasing. And I think this was mentioned yesterday in this thing as well, that, okay, we need to, the CMHC needs to really spike this with a huge amount of money to purchase. So let's say have 20% of the modular markets, spurred by CMHC internally, and make it affordable. How about, or social housing, and then we're doing economic development. And then when the U.S. comes back to their senses, I'm not going to say our senses, their senses, then they will, they'll have to come buy from us. The joke's on them.
Yeah, let's talk modular for a second, because I was sounding very bummerish, and I'm sorry about that. And yesterday I was a little bit more optimistic. So the thing about modular housing, the good thing about modular housing is, or factory-built housing if you prefer, is most of the work happens in a factory as opposed to on-site. Once you have the modules, they can go in fairly quickly and make buildings. And 90, as we heard yesterday, 90% of the components of Swedish single-family housing is factory-built. And that has spin-on impacts. They're better jobs. They're not literally backbreaking. They're not literally start-stop. The factories that are building housing in Canada tend to have more women, more visible minorities, younger people working there who can go home to their families after they're finished their shift much more easily, partly because there's not enough the affordable housing for construction workers. But in any case, for all of those reasons, it's faster. If it's scaled up, it's cheaper. And it tends to lead to a more equitable workforce. You'd want to have modular housing. The disadvantages, the reason why modular housing hasn't been able to scale up in Canada in the way that it's scaled up in Sweden or China or Japan or Austria and the UK are putting a lot of effort into modular housing, is quite simply because there isn't the demand. If you're going to build a factory and you're going to hire a whole bunch of people, you want to know that people are going to buy your product from day one. The simple answer to that is the kind of counter-cyclical investment where at the very least the federal government could guarantee the purchase of a certain number per year, let's say 60, 100,000. That's not impossible in terms of the current industry. But you'd need to have that guaranteed demand before you put the capital into either retooling an auto parts factory or creating a new factory. It's just as simple as that. So it is an opportunity for import replacement, yay.
Just gonna add upon that for our last question together, and then we'll move on to audience Q&A. If you could wave a magic wand and get all the policymakers in one room, from your experience, what major issue would you want them to confront, or what solutions would you suggest? I think you kind of already touched upon some of the policy solutions there, but if there's anything else that you'd like to add?
Again, it's so much magic wanding that we need to be doing right now. Maybe I'd say a couple of things here. One thing that we've discovered through our multi-sector partnership work is the importance of understanding some of the very basics, especially across sectors and people who make decisions about money. Wealth management organizations, banks, policymakers, understanding what a housing pro forma looks like, and understanding what it takes to build housing, what it takes to build affordable housing. And if there's anything that I would wave a magic wand to do, it's having everybody working in housing understand the pro forma. Look at one, understand what the cost sections are and what the levers are associated to those costs. What does it mean, how much labor is part of that pro forma, how much land is part of that pro forma, construction, materials, taxes and fees, because all of these categories of cost, and I know it may sound boring, and it's why do I need to bother with financial matters? But it's such a fundamental piece of what it takes to make the right decisions that lead to all these wonderful outcomes we're going to see around equity, around affordable housing. Because if you don't understand what it takes to build it, you don't understand in what ways you can use the levers that you have under your control to change that. And we've had conversations with, people at BMO that are in a, decision-making position to guide social investment or lending programs. We work with folks at McKinsey and at other organizations that are in the business of private investment. Just understanding what those performances look like and what it takes to actually build housing, it's so fundamental. So anybody studying or going into housing, doesn't matter if it's policy or investment or anything, understand the fundamentals, understand the financials, because if you don't understand that, you're gonna fail in putting in place a powerful argument and really having productive conversations across sectors. Bankers talking to nonprofit organizations talking to unions talking to modular builders and factory developers. All of that go back to the pro forma. And that's the magic wand that I would wave. Everybody gets pro formas.
Yeah, I'd actually follow up from that because I totally agree with what Juliana said and what she said earlier. You're looking at Scarborough, you're looking at X number of people who need homes at $375 or $390 a month. You're looking at a larger number of people who need homes at about $1,050 or less a month. And then you have another number of people who need homes, and not just studio apartments, but 2 and 3 bedroom homes at $1,600 a month. How are you going to get there? Anything's open, let's brainstorm, but how are you going to get there? Because the alternative is people lining up at food banks, people being unable to take public transportation to work, people foregoing educational opportunities, people sleeping on subways, on grates, in libraries, in emergency shelters, which is unacceptable in a rich country like Canada. Okay, that's unacceptable. How do we get to the thing that isn't unacceptable? And it may be difficult decisions. Last week, as I said yesterday, I met a guy, Jean-Guy, who lives in Vancouver in Chinatown, downtownish, where he lives and he has lived in a room for 20 years, 10 feet by 15 feet, maybe the size, maybe a little bit less of a dorm room here. He has a sink, he shares a toilet, he shares a kitchen, he has a disability, he goes up one flight of stairs kind of thing, but otherwise he'd be homeless or dead, probably dead. And instead he has a productive life, he has friends there, great. Then if that's what the best the market can provide, because he's in a privately owned SRO, and we only believe the market can help, let's get 1 million more of those right now, And of course, part of the reason it's 375 is it's 100 years old.
But, let's do acquisitions up the yin-yang. Let's get every existing apartment that's $800 and keep it at some kind of affordable rate kind of thing. So here's the need. How are we going to meet the need? How can your profession, how can your level of government help meet that need? Simple as that.
So, do you have any limits to what we can suggest? So, because I would start with the Constitutional Convention, and what I want to do is actually realign the levels, the orders of government, so that the municipality doesn't just have all the problems, but also has some of the power and some of the funding. And that, I think, until we do that, we're not really going to be able to address our problems in cities, if cities are always working against the province and even the federal level. But since maybe that's not very realistic in Canada, at least at this moment, I would like to go back to something Carolyn said about communication and the need for that. And what I'm very scared about is the rise of disinformation and misinformation and coming over the border. And you know, Canada has worked really on AI governance a bit. It's done some work. It's now stalled at the federal government because we don't have a parliament apparently. But you know, that work has to come back alive. And I think there's a huge opportunity, since we do AI actually really well in Toronto and at the University of Toronto. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to kind of set the bar high in terms of truthiness, in terms of making sure that we get the truth out and that people understand facts again. And so I think it's all going to come back down to education and innovation, and then making sure that the policymakers then regulate that.
Would you like to add anything to each other's points, or should we move on to audience Q&A? Okay. Oh, lots of questions.
I had a specific question to field to you about this disinformation. So are officials implementing the use of like relativistic zero knowledge proofs, like having FPGAs and having some sort of formal verification system so you understand what is fact and what is not? Because I think there were some guys at McGill that published a preprint on this. That's a paper at Nature now. So I was just wondering, how do you determine something like the truthiness of something if you don't have like a formal proving system? So.
I would like to go back to John Maynard Keynes' era, although this is not that era. I mean, that the era of Great Depression. I feel that recently some political situation has made us rethink that era when investments were made for creating jobs in public infrastructure to create jobs to avert the Great Depression. As a first generation immigrant to Canada, I have seen that, what one of the panelists said, that it's unaffordable mostly, and this type of situation is unacceptable. I quite agree with that, and I think there are some responsible stakeholders within this country, and the policymakers did not put proper attention, and they just avoided all these things, especially the financial houses like banks, those who are very much involved with the equity loans, mortgage loans, capital gain tax, and their income. And the government is very much preoccupied with taxes. I think the housing is a kind of thing that is very much related to our fundamental right. And this is time the government revisit its policies with regard to funding or facilitating the basic components of affordable housing, which is land and the other equipments, and make a realistic estimate at what the real cost should be, and what the stakeholders should get, and distinguish between social housing and commercial housing. Well, there will be housing for $1 million and limitless. That will be one sector of the economy. But there should be another sector which will address the low-income groups, which is 1/3 of Canada. And housing should be available as per their income. So what we could do in that regard. Thank you.
Maybe if you'd like to respond about,
The first one,
and then we
the first
can
one, and then
discuss the other.
Yeah. So on truth, it's a really good question. And I think smarter people than me and some of our wonderful computer scientists and legal scholars at the School Cities are working on this already. But I'd just like to point to, so yesterday we were at the Board of Trade, and Carolyn was on a panel, and there was a guy on the panel that repeatedly told lies and mistruths. And so, first of all, he claimed that he invented the term missing middle. He said his organization invented it. That's a lie. So AI could have actually gone and found the origins of the term missing middle. You could ask AI right away, and they would tell you that. And so that's the sort of thing. I wanted to have like a banner above his head saying when it's a ticker saying lie. But there were also a number of partial truths, and this is where it gets complicated. So he said government should get out of the way. Well, okay, maybe government's in the way of market in some ways, but government is providing a lot of things that make the market work better. So it's actually a little bit more complicated than government should get out of the way. He said that trickle-down works, that you need to build more supply, and then that'll help solve the crisis. Well, we know that actually trickle-down doesn't work. We have 30 years of evidence on trickle-down and housing. So, so you should be able to check some of these things. But there's always going to be things that are disputed. And the issue is that people love those narratives. Government, get out of the way, right? It's easy. It's a bumper sticker. Trickle-down, build lots of housing supply. And we won't have a affordability problem. That's another bumper sticker. And so we need to find kind of the alternative bumper stickers too, which are true.
Just in terms of Keynesianism, I mean, he's dead. The idea ain't dead. In fact, over the last presidential era of Biden, there was a sort of watered down Green New Deal that was happening and creating lots of infrastructure and creating lots of jobs. I guess the only criticism, and this goes back to your comment, is it maybe didn't get enough coverage. So people think, oh no, nobody's trying that. I mean, there was a social housing initiative in Australia after the global financial crisis that was extraordinarily effective, not just in creating low-cost homes, but in jump-starting the economy again, and that was connected with a green retrofit program that got terrible press from, Rupert Murdoch, but was super effective too. So I guess part of the challenge is being really, really vocal when there are things working, because goodness knows people are going to be full of, as I call it, and this isn't my term, verb the noun, acts attacks. So, there needs to be a sort of counter voice that's sort of slightly more complex than verb the noun, but also truthful. Okay, that's what I wanted to say.
Is there anything you'd like to add? Okay, go to next question.
Hi. Years ago, I sat on a board called Beatrice House, which provided housing for women and their children. We converted a school out in Caledonia, working with Margaret McCain and Fraser Mustard. We had bachelor apartments, with the cribs for the children, and we had schools and so on. When I was on the board, and I don't know if this has changed, we were getting enough money per night per resident that if each of those residents got the money themselves, they could find housing. Now, I don't know what the rate is that agencies get to house people like that, because at that time, I don't remember the figure. But I'm turning to you. I used to be a vice chair of United Way Toronto, and I was there when we were doing poverty by postal code. So I quite understand those kinds of things. I'm out of the loop. I'm curious to know how much are we giving agencies, whether the government, the municipal, or agencies like United Way, to run social housing, and how much is that if individuals got that money, that they could find housing?
Just because the name United Way was mentioned a couple of times, it kind of depends on the agency and the population it serves. But one thing that we've identified, and the reason why we launched a new program, was that community services agencies need support in keeping the space that they have, and that space in many cases is also associated not with just service provision but also with housing. So serving more complex populations that require not just a place to live but all the supports associated to mental health or other kinds of assistance, childcare or other social supports, it's very much kind of an integrated delivery, if you wish. So what we're trying to do is really support these organizations in keeping their space as a community service organizations, as their hubs, as well as being in a better position to provide the housing that goes particularly with populations that require a more special support and needs. And actually, we're just chatting with YWCA, Beatrix's house, and they have a number of projects that where they're looking to, to acquire buildings, to be in a better place to provide these more complex services. That includes a combination of housing and community supports. So it's less in the ratio, but more in the composition of the program to really support people appropriately across their various needs to provide that stability from a housing perspective, from a financial perspective, and from a health perspective.
So I know we have a few of our law students here, and they may be aware that the law school here is named after somebody who wrote their dissertation 100 years or so ago on what was then known as the Ontario Municipal and Railway Board. I'm curious on, somebody mentioned Robert Moses, so I'd like to get at the idea of the balancing between lots of public input and, say, no public input as your extremes. And we've seen in the last decade a lot of change to what was the Ontario Municipal Board. Then it became the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. Now it's the Ontario Land Tribunal. There's a new provincial policy statement. And we've seen a seesawing between lots of opportunity for public engagement to less opportunity. And I'll get a little bit specific in the question to help guide, which is we're now seeing municipalities denying applications for supportive housing projects, resulting in those charities having to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal. In Sarnia, one of the councillors said, if the OMB wants to, or the OLT wants to do this, they can wear it. And so I'd like to give some thoughts on balancing between getting it done and having the public involved.
Third-party, so-called third-party rights is not democracy. It's never been democracy. There is study after study in Canada and the US that shows that the people who are most likely to protest against a particular planning application are more likely to be wealthy, more likely to be white, more likely to be male, definitely more likely to be older. If you go to any debate around a particular development, for instance in Toronto, I was so shocked because I try not to go to these meetings, it's not good for my blood pressure, but I was at a meeting that was talking about some wholesale zoning amendments in Victoria and BC, and literally every person who spoke against it appeared to be over 60, and literally every person who spoke in favor of it was, I would say, under 35. There's a huge generational inequity that needs to be addressed there in terms of wealth accumulating classes who are very likely, and I'm talking now about generations, older people, boomers like me, who are keeping younger people from being able to live anywhere in well-located, suitably sized cities. So the answer to that is much more permissive zoning. Zoning has become less permissive over the last 50 years, from the early 1970s, and the kind of neighborhood planning that is possible has happened, which is around what's the vision for the community? What kinds of parks do we need? What kinds of mixed-use zones do we need in order to have local jobs, et cetera, rather than saying that people have the right to say who their neighbors are. Because I can guarantee to you that if you, and I do like to be optimistic about human beings, but if you say you have the right to deny your neighbors a place to live, it will be weaponized against poor people, against people with disability, against even older people, even people with kids, against childcare. We've seen that in Toronto, and so much against anybody who has a mental health addiction or has recently been in trouble with the law. It will turn into that kind of human rights nightmare.
always has, always will, as long as those third-party rights are there. The best way to deal with that kind of anti-democratic action is to allow apartment buildings as of right, et cetera, and then you don't have to go through a rezoning, and you don't have to go through 3 years of bullshit that completely dooms a lot of nonprofit projects.
Is there anything you'd like to add? Okay, next question, I guess.
The panel. You have radiated the complexity, the intersectionality of this fraught issue. And my comment, question, query is going to be, can our civics manage the issue? In the last provincial election, in the riding I live in, just adjacent St. Paul's, all the politicians said affordable housing, without explaining. We need to change the matrix in terms of how we calibrate or recalibrate. It's a long-term epistemic. We need to be thinking long-term, ideally with short-term, and speaking truth to power. And that requires active involvement of the citizen, even as simplistic as just voting or understanding the issue. I mean, most people would like to live on Lowther Street, just north of here, but you can't buy into it unless you have about $4 or $5 million. That, in terms of tragedy. Transportation, culture. Culture is the Grundnorm of any society, but it is totally fraught. Is our leadership class or a political class capable of being honest, saying, we don't know, but how can we ameliorate long term by at least respecting the voter as a cognizant, responsible agent? Thank you.
I don't think that was a question.
No.
Just in case you want to. Any other questions for our panelists?
Thanks. The panel's been very eloquent on the need for a major effort around affordable housing. And the point has been made that we haven't done that at least for a generation, really, since CMHC started to get out of housing in the late 80s. So we need it to get back in. But my question to the panel is, on how difficult it will be and what strategies you might have thought of to persuade our decision makers that at this time and place, right now, facing the challenges this country is facing on so many fronts, but one externally induced and very dangerous, that the effort needs to start now and big when we have failed before, when there were not the kind of problems that we're facing now. That is there a way to take the Trump challenge, the fact that we're going to have a 50% tariff on softwood lumber and all of that, and turn that into another set of arguments that socially relevant housing is part of the infrastructure needs to get us past the Trump challenge? Because the older arguments, the ones I share, but unsuccessfully have advocated for a long time, around equity and the values and a fair share, none of that moved the system. The developers and others, it was too hard. The tax issue was too difficult. Now everything is scrambled. But it could also mean a cutback on social virtues rather than a push. Canada's general debt to GNP is about 104%. That's not awful, but it's not good. We've been running up a pretty high deficit without doing the kind of social areas around housing that we need. And we know there's going to be a host of other infrastructure demands. The list will be as long as many people in this room, people will have infrastructure projects. So how do we make the affordable housing case in this really, really difficult time so that the feds and the provinces and cities will listen when we have to double our defense spending on all the other huge demands coming down the pike?
Well, hopefully that's what the three women on this panel have been talking about for the last hour. I will reiterate, I have seen progress in some fronts. I think we all started off with some examples of progress. I think that the comprehensive need assessment, some of the work that's been done with the Housing Accelerator Fund, I know I'm getting into jargon now. I have seen progress on some fronts. The National Right to Housing Act, the very act of the federal government getting back into affordable housing policy. That's good. That's good. That's better than what was there under Harper and also, frankly, under Craychamp. So that's good. And Martin. The challenge, as always, is are we going to respond to an economic crisis by cutting back our funding of governments and retreating from social policy, which weirdly enough is also the preferred response of some when we're doing well economically. So, are we going to do that, or are we going to do what has worked, what worked in the US in the 1930s and help preserve it, I think, against fascism, what has worked in Canada in the 70s and 80s. We as researchers, as advocates, we can only talk about the evidence of what works. We can talk about the visions of what a better society, what Canada's done in the past, what other countries are doing right now to have less expensive building, more equity in housing and transport, more environmental equity, and more economic health. That's what we can do, that's what we must do. And if it has a public impact, great. If not, at least we tried.
I do think we need to kind of shift the narrative. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of like the three bears, where there's one bed is too big and one is too small and the last one is just right. Well, we had maybe we were a little bit too public sector heavy. We didn't have a great market. Public sector pulled out of housing. The private sector took off over. We've started to build up private sector capacity, actually in a really great way. But guess what? They couldn't deal with the affordability piece. So now, okay, what's just right? We need to find that balance between the public and private sector, and we probably need to do it by having the public sector say, okay, private sector, here's your guarantee. We know, you can build anything as long as you make it 100% affordable or 50% affordable. There's a law in California where there's no zoning if you go 50% affordable or more. Let's do that here. Let's give some guarantees. Let's give some funding. We'll pay for a fifth of the units and they'll be modular coming out of our factory over here. But I think we need to rethink those public-private partnerships.
So on the note of public-private partnerships, a lot of our work is bringing unlikely bedfellows together. And I think there's tipping points when, the chorus begins to sound like they're playing from the same song sheet. And when you hear, the RBC and the CIBC reports, like they're all deploring the affordable housing issues. When the Board of Trade is actually quite vocal around, workforce housing, the discourses begin to sound very much like the nonprofit sector and very much like some of the communications from the public sector. Like, I think that's when the opportunity comes to actually make some meaningful change, because the risk of inaction is so great that it actually becomes politically safe to make some of the choices that before did not seem like a safe bet. And political risk, it's huge. It's a huge thing that we're always having to ponder in our engagements with government, in our communications. And we do find ourselves in a moment where I find there's quite a tipping point in terms of all the stakeholders we engage with and alignment across actions that we need to see. So I do, I am hopeful seeing that we can actually do things that we haven't been able to do before, because we're in a moment that just limits our choices tremendously, in all honesty. So from supply chains to to who lives in our cities and how they can, how we can have that equitable society that we spoke in a slightly different way before, but something that is way more palatable in the current political context. Who would have thought, right?
I think we might have to, one more question? Okay, maybe we can squeeze in one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you all again for your time and for joining. Just a quick question about, I guess, acknowledging part of the reality of metropolitan cities, especially cities like Toronto and Vancouver, and much like the U.S., Canada has that issue where so much of the population lives in those metropolitan areas, and then that also, of course, drives price dynamics. You talked about ameliorative measures, and Monty mentioned that earlier, and of course that's needed. But I'm also curious about what advice you would give policymakers in terms of helping to spread some of the population, in terms of, if you keep just simple market dynamics, right? If you keep concentrating them in one area with a limited supply, and yes, you need to build, and yes, there's not been enough over the last however many decades, what advice would you give to policymakers in terms of how they can, in an equitable way, spread people maybe a little bit out? Or is it that they simply just build higher? And especially where you have zoning issues that take years, if not decades, if they're even resolved, what advice would you give to them today in terms of trying to manage that issue? Thanks.
So, so spreading out the population is not going to solve Canada's competitiveness problem, just because, as we know from economic geography, and our president at U of T, that agglomeration is really the key to productivity and innovation. Agglomeration is absolutely key to competitiveness. So we need great metropolitan areas and cities. That said, so we have to fortify Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Halifax, the big cities, the big metros. That said, there's a huge amount of opportunity in what's happening right now with the growth of Calgary, Edmonton, Mississauga, other sub-cities, and we can fortify that more by making sure we have economic development policies that support. Let's put some federal offices in Calgary. Let's have incentives to have economic activity across the. Well, not quite, but
I'm sorry, but there's 50 years of public policy that's really shot down that idea. It's a nice idea.
But it's,
sure.
But there is something to be said. I mean, Calgary and Edmonton, I think, are succeeding right now in making their cities very great places and affordable, and then so they're reversing the kind of formula. So and that's helping. So they're building a place, not a factory.
Absolutely. Calgary, Atlantic Canada, Quebec are all benefiting from the housing affordability crisis. Kitchener-Waterloo are all benefiting from the affordability crisis in Toronto. There's some good and bad things about that, but the whole, as I say, there's been 50 years of trying to set up new towns in Canada and the US and Australia and the UK, and they have been multi-billion-dollar rorts. So, and they're also kind of undemocratic. If people want to move to big cities, I sure did. I was born in a small town. Who am I to say, no, move to this new place?
Well, thanks again, everyone. Please join me in a round of applause, thanking our moderators and our speakers. So just a few housekeeping items. So firstly, we have lunch in the upper library. Feel free to please come join us. Lunch at Massey is usually really great. We have an in-house chef and in-house pastry chef, so do give our food a try. We will reconvene at 1:25 here in the junior conman room, which will be followed by the energy panel, and then a keynote address by our own Councillor Dianne Saxe. So we look forward to seeing you back in an hour.